Hey, RetconRaider here, and welcome back to the third part of the Factions of Phoenix Point Revisited. We've already taken another look at both New Jericho and Sanhedrion, so that means it's time to take a closer look at the Disciples of Anu. Quite possibly the strangest of the three main NPC factions in Phoenix Point, the Disciples are also one of the most mysterious. While the writers for Phoenix Point have revealed a fair amount of information about the origins, goals, and ideologies of the other two factions, they've released very little information when it comes to the Disciples. We know that the Disciples of Anu are essentially a religious cult who worship the Pandora virus, or at least an idealized version of it, and hope to use the virus in a way that allows them to forcibly evolve mankind into something new and better. They believe that humanity is inherently corrupt, a condition that is only made worse by mankind's slavish devotion to technology, and the Disciples seek to instead guide mankind toward what they see as a more natural path. So, does that mean that they're essentially allied with the Pandora virus? Well, no. Based on the information we currently have available, it doesn't look like it's quite that simple. Out of the 20 short stories currently available on the official Phoenix Point website, there are 3 that give us a significant glimpse into the workings of this mysterious cult. The Disciples of Anu short story by Jonas Kairatsis, as well as Fragments of Knowing and Harbinger, both by Alan Stroud. There are also a few other stories that give us some minor clues, further fueling speculation and theory crafting, but let's take a look at the big ones first. The Disciples of Anu short story gives us some rather significant information about the ideology and religious rhetoric used to direct and empower the cultists. Based on reports collected by the Phoenix Project, the Disciples are essentially a fusion of multiple Abrahamic religions, with a heavy focus on the beliefs of doomsday cults. They believe that humanity is inherently corrupt on a biological level and view the Pandora virus as both a divine punishment as well as an opportunity for salvation. They worship an entity they refer to as the dead god, and they seek to find a way to control the Pandora virus, constantly experimenting with new ways to mutate themselves, but without surrendering their minds to the malevolent entity that acts as the driving force behind the virus. The Phoenix Project has records about disciple activity dating back to the 2020s and believes that the cult formed in response to the initial public discovery of the Pandora virus. But they theorize that the Disciples may actually be a much older organization. This seems to be evidenced in their religious text, the Gospel of the Exalted, which does indeed contain several adapted works from Abrahamic religious texts that have been combined with what appears to be a history of the Pandora virus and its arrival on Earth millions of years earlier. Their gospel makes vague reference to several major events surrounding the alien virus, such as referring to the planet Yuggoth as the heaven of the dead god, where the dead god sits upon a throne with 7 sacred beasts before him, and an eternal desolation at his feet. It speaks of the meteor that first brought the Pandora virus to Earth, which they compare to the biblical wormwood, and describe how it infected our oceans and created the microbial mists. Although their texts often seem to refer to the current situation faced by humanity as a whole, many of the situations they describe could also be applied to the fate of the civilization of prehistoric hominids that were wiped out by the Pandora virus during the Pliocene epoch, as described in The Tomb of the Phoenix. This is particularly interesting because it implies that either the Disciples are indeed a very ancient organization, or that they have access to the collective memories of the Pandora virus, or maybe both. In fact, that leads us into our next story, Fragments of Knowing. While the Disciples of Anu short story gives us a lot of information about the Disciples as they are in the year 2050, around the time the game will begin, Fragments of Knowing gives us our only real glimpse of the cult in the years before the widespread Pandora virus outbreak. This story is set around the turn of the century, roughly 50 or so years before the start of the game, but some of the information in it dates as far back as the mid-1800s. In particular, the story makes reference to a plague that fell upon the fictional town of Lyme in 1846. Although we're given very little in the way of details about the event, it could be an event similar to the one seen in The Old Man of the Sea, which itself described how the Pandora virus came into contact with villagers all along the coast of the Isle of Portland, fatally mutating the vast majority of the people it infected. But in the case of Lyme, it appears that the village survived the infection, and over 100 years later, in the late 1900s, the inhabitants are still mutated. Similar to the descendants of the mutant from The Old Man of the Sea, the descendants of the mutated survivors in Lyme also formed a secretive cult, which appears to be the origin of the disciples of Anu. They appear to have remained secretive and insular for over a century, generally turning away or absorbing anyone curious or foolish enough to visit their town. The events depicted in Fragments of Knowing describe the fate of one person who traveled to Lyme on government business, only to end up being captured and partially indoctrinated by the cult. They partially consume his memories, but he continuously resists them, eventually killing himself when he realizes that escape is impossible. The events of this story describe how the cult was made up of mutated humans, at least some of whom displayed obvious aquatic mutations. It also briefly touched upon their religious practices, likely what eventually evolved into their Gospel of the Exalted, even going so far as to imply that all of the infected cultists were connected in some way, perhaps further reinforcing the idea that the Pandora virus forms a collective consciousness with every creature it infects. The cultists seem to refer to this connection as Anu's kingdom, where the worry and the pain all disappears. It's a place where they take away your life and make it into something useful, greater, eternal. Their captive dreams of this connection, describing it as a large creature, its feelers wrapped amongst struggling bodies, drawing from them as they yearn towards its embrace. The people in their symbiotic matriarch, consuming each other slowly in a languid and visceral dance. If this sounds somewhat familiar, it may be because it's revisited in another story by Alan Stroud, namely, Soul Stealing. A story in which a hapless writer is visited in his hotel room by a creature known as the Matriarch, which consumes his mind, feeds upon his body, and begins the slow process of transforming his flesh into a form more useful to the Pandora virus. In many ways, it appears that the cult almost operated in a fashion similar to the Pandora virus, but on a much smaller and slower scale. Much like the virus, they sought to absorb those who came into contact with them, forcibly adding them to their collective in both a mental and physical sense. But later stories clearly show us that the disciples eventually hit a turning point of sorts, where they began to oppose the Pandora virus, or at least the malevolent entity behind it. This is briefly touched upon in The Second Step, which describes how they were a crazy religious cult that wanted to know how to control the virus to achieve transcendence. But it wasn't until Harbinger that we finally got concrete confirmation of the cult's intent. This story told us about a woman named Lisa Owen, who, after being infected with the Pandora virus, somehow adapted to it, causing it to miraculously cure her terminal cancer. What's more, her transformation allowed her to pass on her unique strain of the virus to others through a simple blood transfusion. This quickly brought her to the attention of the new American Republic's military, but before they could detain her, she was intercepted by agents of the Disciples of Anu, who treated her with reverence, attempting to recruit her while speaking of how she could guide them all to salvation. Although skeptical, she did at least agree to hear them out, leaving the story somewhat open-ended. So, what does all this mean? Well, obviously there's still a lot of unanswered questions, but we do have enough information to start making some educated guesses. At this point, I think it's safe to say that the Pandora virus does indeed make up some sort of hive mind or collective consciousness, creating a mental link with everyone it infects. In stories like The Old Man of the Sea and Fragments of Knowing, the virus seems to be weak. It can still cause mutations, But those mutations are often fatal, and it lacks the ability to mentally dominate those that it infects. I think this is an important detail because it would help to explain the cult's apparent change in direction between 1846 and 2055. Although their cult was shaped by their contact with the Pandora virus, they would have remained independent, their autonomy intact, at least until the 2020s when the Pandora virus first began spreading across the Earth once more. This is notably when the disciples of Anu went public, as they actively began searching for ways to control the virus. This is likely because, while they considered the transformations of the virus to be a divine gift, they were resistant to the idea of actively being controlled by the virus. The god that they worshipped was dead, and his gifts were meant to help humanity transcend their limitations, which was likely an interpretation that would be at odds with the reality of a malevolent alien entity attempting to consume and control the planet. So, in their own way, the disciples of Anu are trying to save mankind, just like the other factions are. They're just doing it in what they see as the most practical way. New Jericho seeks to save humanity by fighting the Pandora virus, while Sanhedrion seeks to save humanity in spite of the Pandora virus. But the disciples? Well, they seek to save humanity by absorbing and controlling the Pandora virus. Which is more than a little ironic. From a gameplay standpoint, the benefits of allying with the Disciples of Anu are obvious. They're the only one of the factions willing to openly experiment with human mutation. While every faction will theoretically have to deal with mutations caused by exposure to the Pandora virus, those mutations will generally be random. But the Disciples of Anu have begun to develop the ability to control the nature of these mutations, allowing them to theoretically shape their followers in more predictable and beneficial ways. It is, however, still a rather dangerous and unpredictable process, with potential side effects ranging from disfigurement and crippling handicaps to outright death. Their own gospel speaks of how only a few can survive the changes, but any who do survive those changes are considered the Exalted, the holiest among their number. Inversely, the greatest weakness of working with the Disciples of Anu is likely to be their loathing of advanced technologies. They believe that one of mankind's greatest sins was an over-reliance on such things, so they are likely to offer little in the way of research benefits, outside of their mastery of the Pandora virus. In fact, if the player decides to push the Phoenix Project towards advanced technological or scientific research projects, it's entirely possible that they may end up angering the Disciples. And any attempts to outright destroy the Pandora virus will obviously alienate them as well. They do make use of at least some technology, but it generally appears to be archaic in nature, such as the massive airships that they use to travel between their temples. The developers have confirmed that the player will be able to obtain these airships if they ally with the Disciples, likely providing a slow but cheap means of transporting supplies and personnel from one place to another. But beyond that, it seems unlikely that the Disciples will use much in the way of technology beyond conventional firearms and whatever equipment they need to continue their research into controlling the Pandora virus. In fact, given their rather technophobic ideology, it may be that their ultimate goal of controlling the Pandora virus is outright impossible for them to ever achieve, unless the player decides to use the Phoenix Project's resources to help them achieve it. Though, given that we know there are at least some pieces of living equipment which appear to be the result of Pandora virus research, it's possible that the Disciples of Anu may make use of similar equipment, perhaps combining conventional arms and armor with specially tailored mutant life forms. Unfortunately, that's about all we know about the Disciples of Anu so far. Well, except for one other small but important detail. This promotional image released by Snapshot Games mentions that the Disciples of Anu sacrifice their enemies in a ritual of alien communion. We have no real details about what this ritual might involve, but it does bring up several new questions and theories. For example, we know that in Fragments of Knowing, the Disciples of Anu already used methods to forcibly indoctrinate people into their cult, likely through deliberate exposure to the Pandora virus. Could these sacrifices be intended to convert captured enemies into members of their cult? Or is this indeed some sort of blood sacrifice with only ritual significance? It's worth noting that some of the official fiction implies that the Pandora virus helped to shape certain human cultures, such as the ancient Aztecs and Incans, both of whom practiced blood sacrifice. One story even goes so far as to imply that these sacrifices may have been made to feed a massive fungal mutant that lived beneath an Incan temple in Peru. This could imply that the disciples are simply acting out some sort of communal memory dating back to those ancient cultures, or perhaps dating back even further to memories of life on Yuggoth, the planet that the Pandora virus came from. Or perhaps this could even imply that the massive temple-like havens constructed by the disciples are used to house some sort of massive mutant creatures, which require the sacrifices to remain fed. Unfortunately, for now, the exact details of the cult's inner workings elude us. We'll have to wait until Snapshot Games gives us some more definitive information to work with. Fortunately, they do have at least 5 more official short stories in the works, which we will hopefully be receiving in the near future. Although details are scarce, the current working titles are Colony, Behold the Man, Time Vault, The Good Life, and another as of yet untitled story. And of course, once those stories have been released, you can be sure that I'll happily make some more videos analyzing their content and spinning increasingly absurd theories about what the new information could mean. But for now, this is RetconRaider, signing off. Thanks for listening. Oh, and remember, although I do love talking about Phoenix Point, you can find out all the latest news by visiting the official website, or the crowdfunding campaign over on Fig. You should also check out the official Phoenix Point YouTube channel. They just uploaded a 7-minute video showcasing some of the character designs that they're currently working on. Links are in the description.